The night before my medical school interview at Johns Hopkins, my sister looked me right in the eyes and poured an entire bottle of bleach over my only professional blazer. When I gasped in horror, my parents simply rolled their eyes and told me to stop making a scene. They told me to stop being so jealous of my sister and her success. The next morning, I walked into that prestigious interview wearing my ruined chemical-stained jacket. The dean of medicine took one look at my damaged clothes, and then he glanced down at the full name printed on my application file. The color completely drained from his face. He slowly took off his glasses, his voice trembling as he asked, "Wait, you are her." He had just realized exactly who I was, and more importantly, he realized whose money had bought my sister her own spot in his program. Before I tell you how a ruined cheap blazer helped me take down my toxic family and reclaim a stolen fortune, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight against the people who were supposed to protect you. My name is Zora, and I am 26 years old. To outsiders, my family represented the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, threw lavish charity galas, drove imported luxury cars, and lived in a sprawling mansion in the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. They projected an image of perfect wealthy African-American excellence. But behind the heavy oak doors of our home, the reality was a suffocating nightmare of favoritism and emotional abuse. I was the scapegoat, the family disappointment who chose to work 70 hours a week as a low-paid clinical research assistant, rather than parading around country clubs looking for a rich husband. My younger sister Brianna, who is 24, was their undisputed golden child. Brianna was given everything on a silver platter: designer handbags, a brand new Porsche, and a fully funded lifestyle. She was beautiful, charming to strangers, and absolutely ruthless to me. My parents constantly reminded me that I was plain overly serious and lacking the natural grace that made Brianna so special. Despite living under their roof because I was drowning in undergraduate student debt, I paid my own way. I bought my own groceries, paid for my own car insurance, and saved every single spare dollar to pay for my medical school applications. I wanted to be a cardiovascular surgeon. It was a dream I had nurtured since childhood. Brianna also wanted to go into medicine, not because she cared about healing people, but because she liked the prestige and the elite title. The only problem was that Brianna barely passed her undergraduate science classes. While she partied and networked at exclusive events, I spent my nights hunched over textbooks, desperately trying to build a future where I would never have to depend on Marcus and Vivian again. The climax of their cruelty happened on a Thursday evening in late October. It was the night before the biggest day of my life. I had secured an interview at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. It felt like an absolute miracle. I had spent months preparing for this exact moment. I was standing in the laundry room of our massive house, carefully steaming my one and only professional blazer. It was a cheap black jacket I had bought on clearance, but I had tailored it myself to make it look sharp and presentable. I heard the loud click of designer heels on the tile floor, and Brianna walked in. She was holding a large plastic bottle of concentrated laundry bleach. She leaned against the doorframe, a nasty smirk playing on her perfect lips. She told me I looked pathetic, stressing out over an interview I was never going to pass. She said a plain, boring girl like me did not belong at a place like Hopkins. She said I should just settle for being a low-level assistant, so I would not embarrass the family when I inevitably failed. I ignored her, keeping my eyes focused on the ironing board. My silence only made her angrier. Brianna hated when she could not get a reaction out of me. Without a single word of warning, she stepped forward, unscrewed the cap of the bleach bottle, and tipped it directly over my freshly pressed blazer. I watched in absolute shock as the thick, harsh chemical splashed across the black fabric. Instantly, violent orange and brown stains began to bloom across the shoulders and lapels. The pungent smell of chlorine burned my nose and eyes. I grabbed the jacket, but the damage was already permanent. It was completely ruined. "What is wrong with you?" I yelled, my voice breaking as I held up the destroyed garment. My shout echoed down the long hallway, drawing the attention of my parents. Marcus and Vivian rushed into the laundry room dressed in their evening wear for some high society charity dinner. Instead of asking what Brianna had done, my mother immediately glared at me. Vivian told me to lower my voice and stop being so dramatic. I held up the dripping, ruined blazer, tears of pure frustration stinging my eyes. I told them Brianna had just intentionally poured bleach all over the only outfit I had for my medical school interview tomorrow morning. My father, Marcus, let out an annoyed sigh. He adjusted his expensive gold watch and told me it was obviously just a clumsy accident. He said Brianna was just doing her laundry, and I was standing in her way. Then my mother added the final crushing blow. She said I was always trying to play the victim because I was jealous of my sister. She told me to stop making a massive scene over a cheap piece of clothing, throw it away, and go buy another one with the little pennies I made at my research job. They turned around and walked out, taking Brianna with them. Brianna looked over her shoulder and gave me a victorious, cruel smile before disappearing down the hall. I spent the entire night crying on the floor of my bedroom. I had exactly $12 in my checking account. I could not buy a new jacket. I had a basic button-down shirt and dress pants, but showing up to a formal medical school interview without a blazer was considered highly unprofessional. I had a very difficult choice to make. I could cancel the interview and let my toxic family win, or I could walk into one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the entire world wearing a destroyed garment. I chose not to let them break me. I rinsed the bleach out of the fabric, dried it as best as I could with a hairdryer, and packed it carefully in my bag. The next morning, I flew to Baltimore on the discount airline ticket I had booked months ago. When I arrived at the Johns Hopkins campus, the other candidates in the waiting room openly stared at me. They were all dressed in impeccable, expensive custom suits. I sat there in my black blazer that was covered in massive, jagged, rusty orange bleach stains. I could feel their heavy judgment, but I kept my chin high and my posture perfectly straight. When my name was finally called, I walked into the grand wood-paneled office of the Dean of Admissions. Dr. Montgomery was a highly respected African-American physician with a stern, incredibly intimidating presence. He was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. When I walked in, his eyes immediately locked onto my ruined jacket. His brow furrowed in deep, visible disapproval. He did not even greet me. He simply folded his hands and asked if I truly thought this was an appropriate way to present myself to his esteemed institution. I stood tall, keeping my voice perfectly steady. I told him that my jacket had been intentionally destroyed the night before, and I did not have the financial means to replace it on such short notice. I told him I chose to show up anyway because my extreme dedication to medicine was far stronger than my temporary humiliation. Dr. Montgomery stared at me in heavy silence for a long, uncomfortable moment. He finally sighed, looking entirely unconvinced, and opened my application file resting on his desk. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the top page. He read my full name out loud. Zora Wright Sterling. Suddenly, he stopped speaking. The silence in the immense room became incredibly thick. I watched as the warm color completely drained from his face. His hands actually began to tremble as he slowly took off his glasses. He looked up from the file, staring at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. He leaned forward across the heavy desk, and his voice dropped to a shocked whisper. "Wait, you are her?" "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice steady despite the sudden and intense shift in the atmosphere of the room. "I am Zora Wright Sterling." Dr. Montgomery did not speak immediately. He slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair, his eyes darting between my chemical-stained blazer and the application file resting on his desk. He looked as though he had just seen a ghost. He took a deep, shuddering breath and leaned forward, clasping his hands together tightly. He asked me if I fully understood the weight of the name I carried. I told him I knew my grandmother was a respected doctor, but my parents rarely spoke of her. They always dismissed her work as ancient history, claiming she was a stubborn woman who left them nothing but old medical journals when she passed away 10 years ago. Dr. Montgomery let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed against the wood-paneled walls. He told me that calling Dr. Josephine Wright a respected doctor was like calling the ocean a puddle. He explained that my grandmother had been his personal mentor during his surgical residency. She was a brilliant, unstoppable force in a medical world that constantly tried to shut her out. As an African-American woman in the 90s, she had to fight twice as hard just to be allowed in the operating room, yet she still managed to pioneer a highly specialized cardiovascular device. He pulled a thick leather-bound reference book from his shelf, flipped it open, and pointed to a complex technical diagram. It was called the right valve. He looked me dead in the eyes and explained that her invention completely revolutionized coronary bypass procedures. The device was so flawless, so perfectly engineered, that it quickly became the gold standard in the medical community. It is still actively used in nearly every major cardiovascular hospital across the entire country, including right here at Johns Hopkins. He told me that my grandmother was an absolute legend in these halls, a woman whose genius saved countless lives. Then his expression hardened into one of profound confusion. He gestured toward my ruined jacket. He asked me why the granddaughter of Josephine Wright, a young woman who possessed one of the most brilliant scientific minds he had ever seen on an application, was sitting in his office claiming extreme financial hardship. He asked why the sole legal beneficiary of the Wright Medical Trust was working 70 hours a week for minimum wage. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The Wright Medical Trust. I repeated the words slowly, the syllables feeling entirely foreign in my mouth. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. I told him I was completely drowning in undergraduate student loans. I paid for my own application fees by skipping meals and working double shifts. My parents made it abundantly clear that they would not waste a single penny of their wealth on a disappointment like me. Dr. Montgomery stared at me, his sharp features softening into absolute horror. He turned his computer monitor around so it faced me directly. He tapped the screen, pulling up a highly secure financial disclosure database that the university used for tracking major philanthropic donors. He told me to look closely at the numbers. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the glowing screen. The figures were staggering. The patent for the right valve did not just earn my grandmother academic prestige, it generated massive continuous royalties. Every single time a hospital ordered the device, a percentage flowed directly into the trust. Millions of dollars were deposited into that account every single year. And right there, listed as the primary irrevocable beneficiary, was my name. Zora Wright Sterling. The reality of my entire existence fractured and shattered right in front of my eyes. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a meticulously crafted evil lie. The sprawling mansion in Atlanta, the fleet of imported luxury cars, Brianna's endless supply of designer handbags, and her brand new Porsche. The lavish charity galas Marcus and Vivian hosted to show off their fake success to the local elite. None of it was paid for by my father's vague real estate ventures. None of it was earned through my mother's supposed business acumen. It was all paid for by my grandmother. It was paid for by the blood, sweat, and sheer genius of a woman who wanted to ensure her only medically inclined granddaughter would never have to struggle. The wealth they flaunted, the money they used to control and humiliate me, belonged entirely to me. They had been stealing my legacy for a decade. I sat there in my $12 bleach-ruined blazer, realizing that I was a multimillionaire. I had been living like a desperate servant in my own castle. My parents had convinced me I was a financial burden, a pathetic charity case they were gracious enough to house precisely, so I would never have the confidence to question their authority or look into my own financial background. They kept me exhausted, poor, and depressed to keep me compliant. Dr. Montgomery watched the realization wash over my face. The initial judgment he had held when I walked into his office was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective anger on my behalf. He asked me how long they had been hiding this from me. I told him they had hidden it my entire life. I told him my mother always said my grandmother left us nothing but massive medical debt. He slammed his fist down on the desk, the sudden noise making me jump. He told me that my parents were not just liars. They were actively committing grand larceny on a federal scale. He explained that a trust of this magnitude, structured by someone as brilliant and protective as Dr. Josephine Wright, would have ironclad legal stipulations. The money was legally locked to my name and my name alone. My mind raced violently. If the money was locked to my identity, how were Marcus and Vivian accessing millions of dollars every year to fund their extravagant lifestyle? How was Brianna casually swiping a black card that should have had my name printed on the front? The puzzle pieces were snapping together with terrifying speed. They had forged my signature. They had committed identity theft on their own daughter the moment I turned 18, seizing total control of the trust while convincing me I was entirely worthless. I looked down at the bright orange chemical stains ruining the black fabric of my jacket. The bleach had eaten right through the cheap material. My sister had poured it on me because she felt entitled to destroy whatever little I had. She did it knowing her entire luxurious life was funded by the very person she was tormenting. I looked back up at Dr. Montgomery. The tears of frustration that had threatened to fall earlier were completely gone. The sadness and the feeling of being a helpless victim evaporated, replaced by a cold, highly concentrated rage. I asked him how exactly he had access to my trust fund records on a university database. He took a deep breath, his expression turning grim, and told me that the revelation of my wealth was only the beginning of what my parents had done. He turned the monitor back toward me, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute disgust. He pointed to a highlighted transaction dated just 3 weeks ago. It was a formal philanthropic pledge made to the University Endowment Fund. The amount printed in bold black ink was $2 million. The donors listed were Marcus and Vivian Sterling. I stared at the number, feeling the air leave my lungs. I asked him why a donation from my parents was showing up in my trust fund records. Dr. Montgomery shook his head slowly. He explained that the money did not come from my parents' personal accounts. It was wired directly from the Wright Medical Trust. Because the trust was originally established by one of the most prominent medical pioneers in the history of the hospital, any major transfers involving Johns Hopkins triggered an automatic administrative review. The compliance office had flagged the transaction because it required the explicit, notarized signature of the primary beneficiary. He pulled a printed copy of the authorization form from a red folder on his desk and slid it toward me. I looked down at the signature line. There, written in perfectly forged cursive, was my name. Below my forged signature was a legal addendum stating that I, Zora Wright Sterling, was graciously donating $2 million of my personal inheritance to the university hospital. But the donation came with a very specific, heavily protected stipulation. Dr. Montgomery leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me that this money was not a simple charitable gift. It was a highly calculated, aggressive bribe. The $2 million was earmarked specifically to bypass the standard admissions committee and secure a guaranteed fast-tracked residency spot in the cardiovascular surgery program for one specific candidate, Brianna Sterling. The room spun. I gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany desk to keep myself from physically collapsing. My mind raced back to the laundry room the night before. I pictured Brianna standing there with that arrogant, vicious smirk on her face as she poured bleach over my only interview jacket. She had mocked me. She had told me I was a failure who did not belong at a place like Hopkins. She told me I should settle for being a low-level assistant so I would not embarrass the family. She said all of those things while fully knowing that my parents had just used my stolen money to illegally buy her a seat in the exact same medical program I had spent 4 years agonizingly studying to get into. They did not just steal my wealth to fund their country club memberships and luxury cars. They weaponized my own inheritance against me. They took the legacy my brilliant grandmother built, the money she explicitly left for my future, and used it to artificially manufacture a medical career for their golden child. Brianna barely survived her undergraduate science classes. She lacked the discipline, the intellect, and the compassion required to be a doctor. Yet, my parents had literally purchased her a white coat using my bank account while standing in my laundry room telling me I was a jealous, pathetic burden. Dr. Montgomery watched the horrific realization lock into my features. He told me that when he saw Brianna's application come across his desk, attached to a massive donation, he was immediately suspicious. Her academic records were entirely mediocre. She had no clinical research experience, no published papers, and terrible letters of recommendation. He had planned to reject her application outright. But then, less than 48 hours later, my application crossed his desk through the standard, highly competitive, merit-based admissions pool. He saw my stellar academic transcripts. He saw my hundreds of hours of grueling clinical research. And most importantly, he saw my name. He realized that the brilliant granddaughter of his legendary mentor was applying the honest way while her parents were forging her signature to buy a spot for her unqualified sister. Hai told me he was prepared to call the federal authorities right this second. He offered to pick up the phone contact, the university legal department, and have Marcus and Vivian arrested for wire fraud and felony forgery before the day was over. He promised to personally ensure that Brianna would be permanently blacklisted from every medical school in the country. For a fleeting second, the image of my parents being dragged out of their mansion in handcuffs filled my mind. It would be so easy to let him make that call. It would be immediate justice. But as I looked down at the bright orange chemical burns on my cheap black blazer, a different kind of plan began to form in my mind. Arresting them now would be too quick. It would give them the opportunity to play the victim, to hire expensive defense attorneys with the rest of my stolen money, and to claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding. They had spent a decade making me feel utterly powerless, gaslighting me into believing I was nothing. I did not just want them to go to jail. I wanted to dismantle their entire empire of lies piece by piece. I wanted them to experience the exact same humiliation and powerlessness they had forced upon me. I looked up at Dr. Montgomery, my posture straightening. I told him not to call the authorities. Not yet. He frowned in deep confusion, asking me why I would ever want to delay justice when the evidence of their fraud was sitting right in front of us. I told him that if we struck now, we would only be cutting off a branch of the rot. I needed to pull the entire tree out by the roots. I needed to know exactly how much money they had siphoned from the trust over the years, where they had hidden it, and who else they had bribed. I asked him to do something that went against every instinct he possessed. I asked him to process the $2 million donation. I asked him to officially accept Brianna into the program. Dr. Montgomery stared at me as if I had lost my mind. He firmly stated that he could not in good conscience allow an unqualified fraud to step foot into his operating rooms. I promised him she would never touch a scalpel. I explained that Brianna thrived on stealing the spotlight, and my parents thrived on showing her off to their high society friends. By giving Brianna exactly what she wanted, we would give them enough rope to hang themselves publicly. They were arrogant, sloppy, and overly confident because they believed I was too weak to ever fight back. I needed them to feel completely victorious, so they would drop their guard. I asked him for the contact information of the best federal financial fraud attorney he knew. I needed a shark, someone who could quietly track offshore accounts and follow the paper trail without tipping off my parents. Dr. Montgomery studied my face for a long time. The harshness in his eyes slowly faded into a look of profound, almost reverent respect. He smiled a sharp, knowing smile. He told me I had my grandmother's exact spirit. She never just won a fight. She made sure her opponents never dared to step into the ring with her again. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a thick ivory cardstock business card, and slid it across the mahogany desk. He told me this lawyer owed him a favor, and that they would tear my parents' financial lives apart brick by brick. I took the card and placed it into the pocket of my ruined blazer. The meeting was over. My parents thought they had broken me the night before, but all they had done was awaken a deeply buried, relentless force. I thanked Dr. Montgomery for his time, stood up, and walked out of his office. I was heading back to Atlanta, directly into the lion's den, and I was going to burn it to the ground. The crisp Baltimore air hit my face the second I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the Johns Hopkins Medical Building. I pulled the ruined, bleach-stained blazer tighter around my shoulders. Just an hour ago, wearing this destroyed jacket felt like carrying a neon sign of my own failure. Now it felt like armor. I walked past the pristine courtyards and the groups of wealthy, polished applicants nervously chattering about their chances. I did not look down. I did not shrink away from their judgmental stares. They were fighting and praying for a spot in this institution. I owned the legacy they were begging to join. I navigated the winding campus pathways until I reached the concrete parking garage. Tucked away in a dark corner on the fourth floor sat my 2012 Honda Civic. The paint was chipping on the hood, the front bumper was dented, and the transmission slipped every time I shifted past third gear. My parents drove imported luxury SUVs. Brianna drove a brand new Porsche. They had convinced me I was lucky to even own this rusted piece of metal. I unlocked the heavy door, slid into the torn driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. The silence of the car was deafening. For a single overwhelming moment, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to crush me. My hands shook violently as I gripped the worn steering wheel. A legacy of brilliance, a lifetime of being treated like a parasite in my own home, all while my family fed off my inheritance. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to smash my fists against the dashboard, but I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. Panic and raw emotion were exactly what Marcus and Vivian expected from me. They relied on my anxiety to keep me weak. I could not afford to be weak ever again. I reached into the pocket of my ruined blazer and pulled out the thick ivory business card Dr. Montgomery had given me. The name printed in sharp minimalist text read, Elias Thorne Forensic Financial Litigation. I did not hesitate. I dialed the number on my cracked cell phone and held it to my ear. The line rang twice before a sharp, commanding voice answered. I introduced myself and mentioned Dr. Montgomery. The tone on the other end of the line shifted immediately from clinical distance to absolute razor-sharp attention. Elias did not ask me how my day was. He simply asked what I needed him to find. Sitting in the freezing interior of my beat-up car, I laid out the situation with cold, surgical precision. I did not cry. I did not let my voice waver. I told him about the Wright Medical Trust. I told him about my grandmother, Dr. Josephine Wright, and the cardiovascular patent generating millions in continuous royalties. I explained the forged signature on the $2 million philanthropic bribe meant to secure my sister a residency spot. I laid bare a decade of financial abuse orchestrated by my own parents. Elias listened in total silence. The only sound coming through the receiver was the rapid, aggressive clacking of a mechanical keyboard. He asked for my social security number, my exact legal name, and my grandmother's full credentials to initiate an immediate public records sweep. He told me to stay on the line. For 10 tense minutes, I listened to him work. He explained that pulling the public patent records for the right valve was the easy part. The medical and financial databases clearly showed the massive volume of hospital orders across the country. Tracking where those royalties were being diverted, however, required digging into corporate shell companies. Suddenly, the typing stopped. Elias let out a low, humorless chuckle. He told me that my parents were arrogant, but they were also incredibly sloppy. Within minutes, he had found the first major thread. He read aloud the name of a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The company was called Sterling Horizons. My blood ran ice cold. Sterling Horizons was the exact name of the commercial real estate business my father claimed to run. Marcus had always bragged about his keen eye for property investments, using that fake business to explain away their sudden influx of cash 10 years ago. Elias revealed that Sterling Horizons had not been investing in commercial real estate. The company had been acting as a massive funnel, quietly rerouting the monthly trust payouts into high-risk offshore accounts and luxury asset holdings. He told me that the $2 million sent to Hopkins was basically pocket change compared to what they had drained over the years. The sheer audacity of their theft was staggering. Marcus and Vivian had not just stolen my money. They had built an entire fraudulent empire on my grandmother's genius, plastering their own names over her hard work. I asked Elias what our next move should be. I expected him to tell me to go straight to the police. Instead, he gave me a set of instructions that chilled me to the bone. He explained that if we filed an injunction or alerted the authorities right now, Marcus and Vivian would panic. They would instantly move the offshore money, shred the paper trail, and potentially destroy critical evidence before a judge could freeze their assets. To build an airtight, inescapable federal case, Elias needed time. He needed to subpoena the bank records, trace every single stolen dollar across state and international lines, and document every fraudulent signature. He told me I had to do the hardest thing imaginable. I had to go back to Atlanta, walk through the front doors of that mansion, and pretend I knew absolutely nothing. I had to play the role of the broken, humiliated scapegoat perfectly. I had to let Brianna flaunt her fake medical school acceptance. I had to let my parents treat me like garbage. I had to smile and swallow their insults while Elias built a financial guillotine behind their backs. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingernails dug into my palms. The thought of looking at their smug faces made my stomach turn. But I knew Elias was right. A premature strike would give them a chance to escape. I needed to trap them entirely. I told Elias I could play the part. I had a lifetime of practice being invisible and compliant. They would never suspect a thing. Elias promised to have the full financial autopsy ready in a few weeks. He told me to keep my head down, guard my phone, and wait for his signal. I hung up the call and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The defeated, exhausted girl who had driven up to Baltimore just hours ago was completely gone. I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. As I pulled out of the parking garage and began the long drive back to Atlanta, I knew I was not just going home. I was walking straight into the lion's den, and I was carrying the match that would burn their entire fraudulent world to ashes. The tires of my failing Honda Civic crunched against the pristine white gravel of the sprawling circular driveway. I parked entirely out of place between my father's custom-imported Mercedes and my sister's brand-new Porsche. The imposing brick columns of our Buckhead mansion loomed above me in the fading evening light. It was a fortress built on a foundation of absolute lies. I turned off the ignition, gripping the steering wheel until my hands ached. Elias had told me to play dumb, to keep my head down, and let him build the federal case in the shadows. But as I stared at the grand double doors of the estate, a different strategy crystallized in my mind. Playing dumb would only make them suspicious. Marcus and Vivian knew me as the emotional reactive scapegoat. If I walked in completely silent after my Hopkins interview, they would instantly know something was wrong. To keep them arrogant, I needed to give them a fight. I needed to confront them just enough to make them feel untouchable. I needed them to brag. I stepped out of the car, the cool Atlanta air cutting through the harsh chemical scent, still clinging to my ruined blazer. I pressed the record button on my smartphone, slipped the device deep into my slacks pocket, and pushed open the heavy oak front doors. The sound of clinking crystal and boisterous laughter echoed from the massive gourmet kitchen. The smell of expensive catered seafood and popped champagne filled the air. I walked slowly down the long hallway, my worn shoes silent against the imported hardwood floors. When I turned the corner into the kitchen, the scene before me was a perfectly orchestrated painting of stolen wealth. Marcus was pouring vintage champagne into a tall glass held by Brianna. Vivian was standing beside the massive white marble island, clapping her hands in sheer delight. Brianna had her phone resting on the counter displaying an acceptance email from the Johns Hopkins residency program. They were celebrating the very spot they had illegally purchased with my inheritance. The laughter abruptly died the second my mother noticed me standing in the doorway. Vivian lowered her hands, her joyful expression melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disdain. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the jagged orange bleach stains ruining my jacket. She let out a sharp theatrical sigh, crossing her arms over her designer silk blouse. She asked me why I was still wearing that filthy rag, telling me I was tracking negative energy into a house of celebration. Marcus did not even bother to look at me. He just took a slow sip of his champagne and told me to go up to my room so I would not ruin my sister's special night. I did not move. I did not shrink away or apologize for my presence like I had done every single day for the past decade. I walked straight into the center of the kitchen, closing the distance between myself and the marble island. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the folded financial transfer receipt Dr. Montgomery had given me, and slammed it down flat onto the cold stone surface. The loud smack of paper hitting marble made Brianna jump. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and spoke with a terrifyingly calm voice. I asked her exactly how a $2 million donation secured my sister's medical residency using an account registered to the right medical trust. The kitchen went dead silent. The faint hum of the luxury refrigerator was the only sound in the massive room. Brianna looked down at the paper, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Marcus stiffened his champagne glass, freezing halfway to his mouth. I watched Vivian carefully. I expected to see a flash of panic. I expected her to deny it, to scramble for an excuse, or to claim it was a misunderstanding. Instead, Vivian slowly picked up the piece of paper. She read the forged signature at the bottom. Then the corners of her mouth curled upward. She dropped the loving, concerned mother act instantly. A cold, reptilian smile spread across her face, accompanied by a dark, mocking laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. She tossed the paper back onto the island with absolute disregard. She leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the marble, and looked at me with an expression of pure triumph. She asked me if the old man at Hopkins finally had the nerve to show me the truth. She asked if I truly believed slamming a piece of paper on her counter was going to change anything about my pathetic reality. I demanded to know how she forged my signature to access a federally protected trust fund. Vivian did not flinch. She seemed genuinely thrilled to finally take the mask off and brag about her brilliant deception. She walked around the island, closing the distance between us until she was standing inches from my face. She told me I had always been weak. She said I was far too soft, too emotional, and too naive to ever handle the kind of generational wealth my grandmother had amassed. Vivian proudly detailed exactly how she executed the theft. She reminded me of the frantic weeks right after my 18th birthday. I was severely depressed, overwhelmed by their constant emotional abuse, and struggling to keep up with my college applications. Vivian had brought me a stack of what she claimed were routine tax documents and student loan guarantor forms. She had screamed at me to sign them quickly before I ruined my financial future. In my exhausted, terrified state, I had signed every single page without reading the fine print. I had unknowingly signed a sweeping ironclad power of attorney granting Marcus and Vivian total unrestricted access to the Wright Medical Trust. She poked a sharp fingernail into the lapel of my bleached blazer. She told me I did not deserve a single penny of that money. She launched into a bitter, resentful rant about her own mother. She claimed Dr. Josephine Wright was a brilliant surgeon, but a terrible, emotionally distant parent who cared more about saving strangers on an operating table than raising her own daughter. Vivian said she suffered her entire childhood in the shadow of a legend. The millions of dollars generating in that trust were her rightful compensation for enduring a mother who never paid attention to her. Vivian turned and gestured grandly toward Brianna, who was standing frozen by the champagne bottles. She declared that Brianna was the perfect heir to the family empire. Brianna understood how the world truly worked. Brianna knew how to navigate the elite social circles of Atlanta, how to charm wealthy investors, and how to project the exact image of Black excellence that society demanded. Vivian looked back at me with pure disgust. She said I was exactly like my grandmother, obsessed with books, hiding in laboratories, and completely lacking any social grace. She told me real wealth belongs only to those who are ruthless enough to take it and smart enough to use it. Marcus stepped forward, stepping between me and my mother. He towered over me, using his physical presence to enforce the threat. He told me to drop the righteous indignation immediately. He stated that even if I knew the truth, I had absolutely no power to do anything about it. He bragged that they had spent the last 8 years aggressively laundering the trust payouts through his commercial real estate company. The money was tangled in offshore accounts, shell corporations, and legitimate property investments. Marcus leaned down, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. He told me to be very realistic about my current situation. If I dared to hire a cheap lawyer and take them to court, they would absolutely bury me. They would use my own stolen millions to hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in the state of Georgia. He threatened to drag my mental health history into the public record. He promised to have a judge declare me mentally unstable, citing the depression they had intentionally caused as proof that I was unfit to manage my own affairs. They would lock me in a psychiatric facility before they ever let me see a single dime of my grandmother's money. I stood my ground. I did not let a single tear fall. I did not scream or throw things. I just looked at the two people who were supposed to love and protect me, realizing they were nothing more than highly sophisticated parasites. They felt completely invincible. They believed their wealth and social standing made them untouchable gods in our city. They had no idea that the smartphone resting quietly in my pocket was recording every single syllable of their arrogant confession. They had just provided Elias Thorne with the exact audio evidence required to fast-track a federal racketeering and wire fraud indictment. They handed me the murder weapon for their own financial execution. I opened my mouth to respond, ready to play my part as the defeated, helpless daughter one last time to seal the trap. But before I could utter a single word, the heavy brass handle of the front door clicked loudly, echoing down the long hallway. Heavy, confident footsteps approached the kitchen. A booming, incredibly arrogant voice called out, demanding to know why the celebration had started without him. The tension in the kitchen instantly shifted. Marcus stepped back, forcing a welcoming smile onto his face. Vivian rapidly smoothed her hair, her entire demeanor transforming back into the gracious, accommodating high society hostess. I turned toward the hallway entrance just as he walked into the room. It was Spencer, Brianna's fiancé, and the final, most dangerous piece of this twisted family puzzle. Spencer was the sole heir to the Spencer Investment Group. He carried a legacy of old Southern money that stretched back generations, and he wore his wealth like a weapon. He walked into our kitchen wearing a bespoke navy suit that easily cost more than my entire vehicle, striding with the effortless entitlement of a man who had never once been told no. Brianna instantly detached herself from the marble counter and practically glided across the room, throwing her arms around his neck. She pressed a dramatic kiss to his cheek, completely transforming her vicious, gloating demeanor into that of a sweet, adoring fiancé. Spencer wrapped one arm around her waist, but his sharp, pale blue eyes immediately locked onto me. The easy, arrogant smile on his face vanished in an instant. He looked at my cheap, bleach-ruined black blazer, and his upper lip curled in an expression of profound disgust. He asked what on earth I was doing, standing in the middle of a celebration looking like I had just crawled out of a dumpster. Vivian rushed forward, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she greeted him. She completely ignored his insult toward me, and instead offered him a glass of vintage champagne. Marcus stood up straighter, adjusting his posture to mirror Spencer's commanding presence. It was physically sickening to watch my parents, who had just spent the last 10 minutes bragging about their untouchable power and ruthlessness, instantly shrink themselves to accommodate the presence of old white money. They were desperate for Spencer's family to legitimize their own stolen wealth in the upper echelons of Atlanta society. Spencer ignored the champagne Vivian offered. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, releasing Brianna's waist. He looked me up and down, making sure to project his absolute contempt. He told me that my mere presence was dragging down the energy of the entire house. He said he had just spent the entire afternoon finalizing the exclusive details for his wedding with Brianna, a wedding that was going to be featured in major society magazines across the country. I explicitly stated that the Spencer family name was synonymous with absolute perfection, and he simply could not tolerate having a miserable, failed sister-in-law walking around his future family looking like a walking tragedy. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a slim designer leather wallet. With agonizing slowness, he slid his thumb against a thick stack of cash. He pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills. He did not hand them to me. He flicked his wrist carelessly, tossing the $500 directly onto the cold marble island where the forged trust fund receipt still lay. The bills scattered across the stone surface. Spencer leaned in, his voice dropping to a condescending, venomous tone. He ordered me to take the cash, go to a decent department store, and buy a jacket that did not smell like cheap laundry chemicals. He told me to stop acting like a jealous, destitute burden. He said I needed to accept that Brianna was going to be a brilliant surgeon and the wife of a billionaire, while I was never going to amount to anything more than a bitter, low-level assistant. He finished his rant by telling me to grab the money, disappear into my room, and stay completely out of their way until I learned how to smile and be grateful for the roof over my head. I stood completely still, staring at the green paper resting on the marble. The humiliation burned hot in my chest, a physical fire demanding to be unleashed. I wanted to grab the heavy champagne bottle and smash it across the pristine white counter. I wanted to scream that the very money Spencer was marrying into was stolen directly from the woman he was currently insulting. I wanted to tell him that his perfect fiancée was a fraud who bought her way into medical school with my inheritance. But before I could even formulate a response, Marcus and Vivian jumped in to eagerly defend Spencer. My father clapped Spencer on the shoulder, laughing loudly as if Spencer had just delivered a brilliant punchline. Marcus told Spencer he was far too generous to a girl who did not deserve a single ounce of his charity. My own father looked at me with cold, dead eyes, and commanded me to thank my future brother-in-law for his incredible kindness. Vivian immediately echoed the sentiment. She stepped up beside Spencer, nodding vigorously in agreement. She told me I was acting completely ungrateful. She claimed Spencer was doing me a massive favor because my appearance was an absolute embarrassment to the Sterling family reputation. She urged me to grab the cash and leave the kitchen immediately so they could toast to Brianna's medical school acceptance without my toxic, jealous energy poisoning the room. Brianna clung to Spencer's arm, again burying her face against his shoulder while faking a dramatic, exhausted sigh. She told Spencer that I was just throwing a tantrum because I had failed my own interviews that morning and could not handle seeing her succeed. She played the perfect victim, whispering that I had been trying to ruin her special day ever since she got the acceptance email. Spencer kissed the top of her head, shooting me a glare of protective anger, fully buying into her fabricated performance. The dynamic in the room was a masterclass in psychological abuse. My parents were willing to sacrifice my dignity in a heartbeat just to keep Spencer happy. They were so blinded by their greed, so desperate to secure the merger of the Sterling and Spencer families, that they would happily watch this arrogant man humiliate their own flesh and blood. They worshipped his money and his status, completely ignoring the fact that their own status was a hollow lie built on my grandmother's stolen patents. My hand twitched at my side. My thumb brushed against the fabric of my slacks, feeling the solid rectangular shape of my smartphone resting in my pocket. The recording app was still running silently. It was capturing every single word of this disgusting interaction. It was capturing my parents' complicity, Brianna's lies, and Spencer's absolute financial arrogance. Elias Thorne's instructions echoed loudly in my mind. He had warned me not to tip them off. He told me to let them feel invincible. He insisted that I let them believe they had completely crushed me because the trap required their absolute, unchecked confidence to work. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the burning anger down into a tight, hardened knot in my stomach. I relaxed my shoulders, dropping my posture to mimic the defeated, broken girl they all expected me to be. I lowered my eyes, ensuring they saw no trace of the newly discovered billionaire heiress who had just hired a ruthless federal fraud attorney. I looked down at the $500 scattered on the marble counter. With agonizingly slow movements, I reached out my hand. My fingers brushed against the cold stone as I gathered the 5 crisp bills. I picked up the money, folding it neatly in half. I did not look at Spencer. I did not look at Brianna. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, playing the role of the humiliated scapegoat to absolute perfection. I clutched the money in my hand, my voice intentionally quiet and shaking just enough to sell the performance. I muttered a hollow, defeated word of thanks. I told them I would get out of their way so they could celebrate in peace. Spencer let out a short, satisfied scoff. He turned his back to me, completely dismissing my entire existence. As he reached for the glass of champagne Vivian was holding out to him. Marcus and Vivian immediately resumed their joyful, fawning chatter, loudly congratulating Brianna on her fake medical residency and praising Spencer for his visionary leadership at his family investment firm. I turned around and walked out of the gourmet kitchen, the sound of their clinking crystal glasses ringing in my ears. I walked down the long, opulent hallway of the mansion, my cheap shoes silent against the hardwood floors. With every step I took away from them, the subservient, defeated posture melted away from my body. My spine straightened, my head lifted. A cold, predatory smile slowly spread across my face. They thought they had won. They thought $500 and a few cruel insults were enough to put me back in my place forever. They had no idea that I had just secured the audio confession that would send my parents to federal prison. They had no idea that their precious high society wedding was going to become the most spectacular financial execution in the history of Atlanta. I reached the door to my small, cramped bedroom at the end of the hall. I walked inside, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and pulled my smartphone out of my pocket. I stopped the recording and immediately uploaded the encrypted audio file to the secure cloud server Elias Thorne had set up for me. The bait was successfully placed, the evidence was secured, and now it was time to let them eagerly dig their own graves. The green upload confirmation checkmark on my phone screen felt exactly like the firing of a starting pistol. Less than 30 seconds after the audio file successfully transferred to the secure cloud server, my phone vibrated in my palm. The caller identification displayed a restricted number, but I knew precisely who was on the other end. I answered the call, pressing the speaker tightly to my ear while keeping my eyes fixed on my locked bedroom door. Elias Thorne did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He told me he had just listened to the entire raw audio recording. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, operating with the cold, lethal precision of a federal prosecutor who had just been handed a smoking gun. He told me that Marcus, Vivian, and Brianna had just legally crucified themselves by explicitly acknowledging the forged signature on the donation, bragging about the laundering scheme, and admitting their intention to use the right medical trust to fund a fake medical residency. They had handed us airtight proof of criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and grand larceny. But Elias warned me that a recorded confession was only the foundation of the cage. To permanently lock the door and throw away the key, we needed the exact routing numbers for the offshore accounts Marcus had bragged about. Elias explained that tracking the stolen money through standard domestic banking channels would take months of bureaucratic maneuvering. That delay would give my parents ample time to realize they were under federal investigation, allowing them to move the funds, shred the paper trail, and completely disappear the assets before a judge could intervene. We needed to bypass the red tape immediately. We needed the physical account ledgers. I told Elias that my father was incredibly arrogant, but he was also deeply old school. Marcus did not trust cloud storage or digital encryption for his most illicit financial transactions. He liked to hold his wealth in his hands. He kept a heavy fireproof biometric safe hidden inside his mahogany-paneled study on the ground floor of the mansion. Elias told me that if I could get clear, undeniable photographic evidence of those routing numbers, he could secure a sealed federal freezing order before Brianna and Spencer even had the chance to mail out their lavish wedding invitations. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. The mansion was still vibrating with the heavy bass of the music playing downstairs. Marcus, Vivian, Brianna, and Spencer were currently on their third bottle of vintage champagne, entirely consumed by their own fabricated success and social dominance. I slipped out of my bedroom, moving like a ghost through the sprawling, shadowed corridors of the second floor. I reached the heavy double doors of my father's private study. It was strictly off-limits to everyone in the house, especially me. The door was secured with an advanced digital keypad. I did not panic. I knew my father better than he knew himself. He was a raging narcissist who believed his own manufactured legacy was the center of the universe. I reached out and punched in the 6-digit date of the exact day he founded Sterling Horizons, the fake commercial real estate company he used to launder my stolen inheritance. A small green light flashed and the heavy locking mechanism clicked open. I pushed the door and slipped inside, letting it shut silently behind me. The room smelled strongly of expensive imported cigars, aged leather, and stolen money. I bypassed the massive executive desk and walked straight toward the built-in custom bookshelves lining the far wall. I reached behind a framed photograph of Marcus shaking hands with the mayor of Atlanta, finding the hidden mechanical lever my father thought was a brilliant secret. The entire bookshelf swung open on silent hinges, revealing the cold steel face of his biometric safe. This was where my meticulous, quiet observation over the past decade paid off. My parents had treated me like a glorified maid my entire life. I had spent countless evenings cleaning this exact study, dusting these exact shelves while they hosted high society galas in the ballroom. During one of those cleaning sessions years ago, I had watched Marcus open this safe from the reflection of the glass display case across the room. I knew he kept the physical override key taped flush beneath the bottom drawer of his desk, entirely convinced that no one in his house was smart enough or brave enough to ever look for it. I walked over to the desk, reached under the bottom drawer, and retrieved the small metal key. I slid it into the manual override slot on the safe and turned it sharply. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside, stacked alongside thick bricks of emergency, $100 bills and velvet boxes containing my mother's diamonds, was a thick black leather ledger. I pulled it out and opened it under the dim, focused beam of my smartphone flashlight. It was an absolute masterclass in financial corruption. Page after page detailed the exact dates and amounts illegally transferred from the right medical trust. Next to each massive withdrawal was the corresponding offshore routing number in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Panama. He had meticulously documented every single stolen dime, driven by his obsessive, greedy need to track his own illegal wealth. I saw line items detailing the purchase of Brianna's Porsche, the down payment on the mansion we were currently standing in, and the exact $2 million bribe sent to Johns Hopkins. I held my breath, my hands working with absolute robotic precision as I photographed every single page of the ledger. I captured the account numbers, the transfer dates, the shell company names, and the offshore bank contacts. Once I had captured every piece of evidence, I closed the ledger and placed it back inside the safe exactly the way I found it. I locked the heavy steel door, swung the bookshelf shut, and returned the manual override key to its hiding spot beneath the desk drawer. I left the study, ensuring the digital lock engaged securely behind me, and drifted back up the sweeping staircase to my cramped bedroom, just as a fresh, roaring wave of laughter erupted from the kitchen downstairs. I locked my bedroom door and immediately forwarded the highly encrypted batch of photographs directly to Elias. A single text message came back from him exactly 2 minutes later. It simply read, "We have them. We have." I tossed my phone onto the bed and looked down at my cheap, chipped nightstand. The 5 crisp $100 bills Spencer had casually thrown at me were sitting right where I had left them. I walked over and picked up the cash, running my thumb over the rough edge of the paper. Spencer had aggressively ordered me to use his money to buy a new jacket so I would not embarrass his elite old money family. He thought he was putting a pathetic, jealous failure in her place. Instead, I was going to use his $500 to pay the mandatory filing fees for the federal injunction that would completely freeze his future wife's assets and eventually destroy his father's massive investment firm. The silent war had officially begun. I was no longer just the scapegoat of the Sterling family, and I was no longer merely a helpless victim drowning in their emotional abuse. I was the invisible architect of their total destruction. They were completely oblivious, happily drinking champagne and planning their extravagant futures, while the ground beneath their feet had already begun to collapse. I took off my bleach-ruined blazer, folded it carefully, and placed it in the back of my closet. I was going to need it later. Tomorrow I had to return to my grueling, underpaid job as a clinical research assistant at the hospital laboratory. I knew Brianna would be starting her fraudulently purchased residency soon, and she would undoubtedly try to use her new position of power to make my professional life a living hell. Let her try. She was walking into a medical facility carrying a fake crown, completely unaware that I was already holding the executioner's axe. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Atlanta Cardiovascular Research Institute buzzed overhead. I was staring at my dual monitors running the final predictive models on a complex algorithm I had spent 3 years developing. It was a groundbreaking tool designed to map the exact failure rate of artificial heart valves during high-risk surgeries. I was operating on 3 hours of sleep, running purely on black coffee and the cold, sharp adrenaline of knowing my parents' federal indictment was currently being drafted. The heavy glass doors of the laboratory swung open. The director of research, a balding, perpetually stressed man, who usually ignored the junior staff, clapped his hands loudly to get everyone's attention. He announced that the institute had just received an unprecedented funding grant and was welcoming a brand new senior clinical fellow. He gushed about her stellar academic record, her recent acceptance into the Johns Hopkins Surgical Residency Program, and her profound dedication to cardiovascular medicine. Brianna strutted into the laboratory. She was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored white coat that looked like it belonged on the cover of a high-fashion magazine, rather than a sterile medical facility. She paired it with red bottom heels that clicked sharply against the linoleum floor. The sheer audacity of her presence made my blood boil. Marcus and Vivian had not just bought her a spot at Hopkins. They had leveraged that fraudulent acceptance and used the remaining stolen trust fund money to buy her a senior position right here in my workplace. They wanted to ensure I was humiliated not just at home, but in the one place I considered my sanctuary. Brianna scanned the room, her perfectly manicured hand resting on her hip. Her eyes locked onto my workstation in the back corner. A vicious, triumphant smile spread across her face. She walked straight past the seasoned researchers and stopped right at my desk. She leaned down, her expensive perfume masking the smell of rubbing alcohol in the lab. She loudly announced to the entire room that she was looking forward to whipping the junior staff into shape, especially the ones who lacked natural talent. Within her first hour, Brianna made her true intentions entirely clear. She did not open a single medical journal. She did not review any patient charts. In fact, I highly doubted she even knew how to properly read a basic electrocardiogram. Instead, she summoned me to her massive new glass-walled office. She sat behind a sleek desk she had not earned and tossed a stack of disorganized generic paperwork at me. She ordered me to sort her lunch receipts and fetch her an iced matcha latte. She spoke to me with the exact same condescending, venomous tone she used at the mansion. She wanted the entire research team to see me acting as her personal servant. I did not argue. I did not throw the papers back in her face. I picked up the stack, nodded politely, and walked out. Elias Thorne had told me to let them feel invincible. I knew that every single time Brianna abused her fraudulent power, she was adding another layer of institutional corruption to her eventual federal indictment. I fetched her expensive coffee. I sorted her useless receipts. I played the broken, obedient scapegoat flawlessly. But the petty humiliation was not enough for Brianna. By Wednesday afternoon, the situation escalated from childish bullying to dangerous intellectual sabotage. Spencer had been pressuring Brianna to present a tangible, profitable medical breakthrough to his father's billionaire investment group. Spencer's family firm wanted to monetize her supposed medical genius before the wedding to justify merging their old money empire with the Sterling family. Brianna was panicking. She possessed absolutely no original research, no clinical data, and zero understanding of cardiovascular mechanics. She began hovering around my workstation. She watched the complex, shifting data sets running on my monitors. I was finalizing the core predictive sequence of my algorithm, a sequence that could save hospitals millions of dollars and prevent countless surgical fatalities. Brianna did not understand the complex mathematics involved, but she absolutely recognized the massive dollar signs attached to my work. Thursday morning, I returned from a mandated coffee run to find Brianna sitting directly in my chair. She was actively clicking through my secure research folders. I demanded to know what she was doing. She stood up, smoothing her designer skirt, and loudly declared that she was performing a routine quality control check on the junior staff. She then clicked a button on my keyboard and intentionally deleted an entire week of critical control group data. My heart slammed against my ribs. I watched months of painstaking clinical trials vanish from the screen. Brianna looked at the lab director, who had walked over to investigate the commotion. With absolute fake concern, she lied directly to his face. She claimed she had caught me falsifying patient records to cover up my own incompetence. She told the director that I was a massive liability to the institute and that she was stepping in to personally take over the algorithmic project to save the hospital's reputation. The lab director, completely blinded by the massive donation my parents had just funneled into his department, did not even ask for my side of the story. He nodded subserviently to Brianna. He officially reassigned my 3 years of grueling, groundbreaking research entirely to her name. He turned to me and told me I was incredibly lucky that Brianna was willing to fix my careless mistakes instead of terminating my employment immediately. I stood there in my cheap scrubs, completely stripped of the only professional accomplishment I had ever owned. Brianna plugged a diamond-encrusted flash drive into my computer tower. She dragged and dropped the entirety of my life's work into her personal folder. She looked at me with a cold, dead stare and whispered that I was nothing. She said I would always be nothing, and that she was going to take everything I ever touched and make it her own to secure her place in Spencer's billionaire family. I watched her pull the flash drive from the port and strut back to her glass office. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or devastation. They were shaking with pure, unadulterated anticipation. Brianna thought she had just stolen a multi-million-dollar medical breakthrough to present to Spencer's elite family. She thought she had completely destroyed me. She was so blinded by her own arrogance and greed that she never bothered to actually understand the science she was stealing. What my arrogant, medically illiterate sister did not realize was that cardiovascular algorithms are incredibly fragile hypercomplex systems. They require flawless continuous coding to function properly. When she maliciously deleted that control group data to frame me, she did not just erase a week of work. She fundamentally destabilized the core predictive sequence of the entire project. More importantly, she had absolutely no idea that I had anticipated her greed. Over the last 48 hours, I had been quietly hard-coding a deeply buried invisible fault line into the deepest layers of the software. I had built a mathematical trap right into the data. It was a localized data watermark, an intentional catastrophic coding error wrapped in complex medical jargon that would only trigger when the presentation software attempted to run a full diagnostic simulation. Brianna had just stolen a ticking time bomb. She was about to walk into a boardroom full of elite medical investors, holding a stolen algorithm that was mathematically programmed to self-destruct the second she tried to demonstrate her fake genius. I turned back to my empty computer screen, a dark, satisfied smile forming on my face. She wanted my work. Now she was going to choke on it. Less than 24 hours later, a fleet of black armored sport utility vehicles reserved VIP parking spots at the front entrance of the institute. I watched through the reinforced glass of the second-floor laboratory as a team of men in immaculate dark-tailored suits stepped out into the humid Atlanta morning. At the center of the group was Richard Spencer, the billionaire patriarch of the Spencer Investment Group. He was a tall, imposing man, with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. He walked with the arrogant certainty of a man who owned everything he looked at. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, were waiting for him by the front doors. They practically tripped over themselves to greet him, their faces stretched into desperate fawning smiles as they ushered the billionaires into the facility. They were heading straight for the executive boardroom on the top floor. Today was the preliminary pitch. Brianna was going to present my stolen cardiovascular algorithm to Richard Spencer to secure a massive $10 million initial funding round. Spencer's firm wanted exclusive rights to patent and distribute the software across their private hospital networks, and my parents were eager to facilitate the deal to merge their families and solidify their fake social standing. I knew I had already rigged the data with a fatal invisible coding error, but Elias Thorne had given me very specific instructions. For a federal fraud and intellectual property theft charge to stick perfectly, I needed to establish a documented official trail of protest. If I stayed silent, their defense attorneys could later argue that Brianna and I had a collaborative misunderstanding. I had to publicly and formally declare the research stolen in front of witnesses. I had to force my father to use his fraudulent power to silence me. I needed them to actively commit corporate espionage right out in the open. I untied my hair, smoothed down my cheap hospital scrubs, and walked out of the laboratory. I took the staff elevator up to the executive suite. The hallway was lined with catered breakfast carts and nervous administrative assistants. I did not stop at the reception desk. I pushed straight past the protesting secretaries and shoved open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The room was a picture of extreme wealth and unearned privilege. Richard Spencer sat at the head of this massive glass table, his hands folded as he stared at the projection screen. Spencer sat beside him looking smug and triumphant. Marcus and Vivian were seated opposite them, practically vibrating with excitement. At the front of the room stood Brianna. She had a remote clicker in her hand, and my proprietary data loaded onto the massive display behind her. The entire room froze the second I walked in. Vivian let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical horror. Marcus slammed his coffee cup down onto a saucer, his face instantly turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. Brianna gripped the podium, her eyes wide with sudden panic. I did not look at my family. I looked directly at Richard Spencer. I spoke with a loud, unwavering voice that carried into the hallway. I told him that the cardiovascular algorithm displayed on that screen was completely fraudulent. I stated clearly and firmly that every line of code, every clinical trial, and every predictive model belonged entirely to me. I warned him that Brianna Sterling had illegally copied the data from my secure workstation the previous afternoon. I told the billionaire patriarch that if his firm invested a single dime into this presentation, they would be funding stolen intellectual property and putting thousands of surgical patients at severe risk of death. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard Spencer narrowed his eyes, studying my cheap scrubs and my defiant posture. He then slowly turned his gaze toward Marcus. He asked my father if this was some kind of highly inappropriate joke. Spencer immediately jumped to his feet, pointing a manicured finger at me. He loudly apologized to his father, claiming I was nothing but Brianna's deeply disturbed, jealous sister. He said I was a low-level clinical assistant who had a long documented history of mental instability. He told the room I was completely obsessed with ruining Brianna's life because I could not handle my own miserable failures. Vivian immediately joined the chorus of lies. She stood up, her voice trembling with fake maternal sorrow. She apologized profusely to the Spencer family, claiming my sudden outburst was the tragic result of a severe psychological breakdown. She said I had stopped taking my medication and was prone to these violent delusional episodes. Brianna even managed to squeeze out a few fake tears, whispering that she had tried so hard to help me. But my jealousy had completely blinded me to reality. I stood my ground, my expression entirely blank. I told Richard Spencer to ask Brianna to explain the specific variable calculus behind the aortic pressure model currently displayed on the screen. I challenged her to define the basic mathematics of the software she claimed to have written. Brianna's face flushed violently. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked helplessly at Marcus, her eyes pleading for a rescue. My father did not hesitate. The mask of the sophisticated high society businessman slipped away entirely, revealing the ruthless cornered thief underneath. He pulled his cell phone from his tailored suit pocket and dialed a number. He put the phone on speaker, demanding to speak directly to the chief administrator of the hospital and the director of human resources. Within 2 minutes, both hospital officials were standing in the doorway of the boardroom, looking completely terrified. Marcus used his physical size and his status as a major donor to dominate the space. He pointed directly at me. He loudly declared that I had just attempted to sabotage a multi-million-dollar corporate merger and steal confidential data from a senior clinical fellow. He reminded the hospital administrators that the Sterling family had just generously donated $2 million to their facility. He demanded my immediate termination for gross insubordination, corporate espionage, and creating a hostile work environment. The chief administrator, a man who cared far more about keeping his wealthy donors happy than protecting an underpaid assistant, did exactly what Marcus commanded. He looked at me with cold detachment and told me I was officially fired, effective immediately. He ordered me to hand over my hospital identification badge and my access keys. He signaled to the 2 large security guards waiting in the hallway, instructing them to escort me to my desk, to pack my personal belongings, and then remove me from the premises. I reached up and unclipped my plastic identification badge. I tossed it onto the pristine glass table. It slid across the surface and stopped right in front of Richard Spencer. I looked the billionaire dead in the eyes one last time and told him he had been warned. The security guards flanked me, grabbing me firmly by the arms. As they turned me around to march me out of the boardroom, Marcus stepped directly into my path. He leaned down, bringing his face dangerously close to mine. He completely ignored the audience of billionaires and hospital administrators. He whispered in a low, vicious tone that only I could hear. He told me I was entirely dead to this city. He promised me I would never work in the medical field again. He said he was going to personally ensure that every hospital, every clinic, and every research laboratory in the state of Georgia threw my resume in the trash. He threatened to have the locks changed on my apartment and to legally bleed me dry until I was sleeping on the streets. He smiled a dark, victorious smile, completely convinced he had just permanently destroyed my life to protect his stolen empire. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I just stared right back into his cold eyes and offered him a slow, chilling smile. I told him I would see him at the wedding. I turned and let the security guards escort me out of the boardroom. We walked down to the ground floor laboratory. The entire research team stopped working, watching in stunned silence as I was handed a small cardboard box. I packed my favorite coffee mug, a framed photo of a sunset I took during college, and a few reference books. The guards marched me out through the automatic sliding glass doors and into the stifling heat of the Atlanta afternoon. The heavy doors locked behind me with a solid final click. I stood on the blistering pavement holding my cardboard box. To the casual observer, I looked like a completely defeated woman who had just lost her career, her reputation, and her family in a single devastating blow. But as I walked back to my rusted Honda Civic, my heart was racing with pure, unadulterated triumph. Marcus had just handed me the final necessary piece of the puzzle. By using his financial leverage to aggressively fire me and protect the stolen research, he had formally documented his active participation in the theft. He had left a massive, undeniable paper trail of corruption involving hospital administration. Elias Thorne now had everything he needed to wrap the federal wire fraud charges into a massive racketeering case. They had taken the bait perfectly. Brianna was currently standing in an executive boardroom, desperately trying to sell a multi-million-dollar algorithm she did not understand to a family of ruthless investors. She had no idea that the software was programmed to completely disintegrate the moment she tried to run it live. Marcus had no idea that his threats had just been added to a growing federal indictment file. Vivian had no idea that her precious high society wedding was going to be the stage for their total financial execution. I placed my cardboard box in the passenger seat and started the engine. I pulled out of the hospital parking lot, leaving the sterile white buildings far behind me. I had lost my job, but I had secured my vengeance. The countdown had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy every single second of their impending destruction. As my car merged onto the bustling interstate, the image of Richard Spencer staring intently at the projection screen played on a continuous loop in my mind. They thought they had just seized a flawless multi-million-dollar masterpiece. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 48 hours building a digital guillotine directly into the source code. I knew Brianna was circling my workstation like a vulture. I knew my parents were desperately seeking a lucrative asset to offer the Spencer family to secure the wedding and the corporate merger. I also knew that Brianna was completely medically illiterate. She could barely read a basic blood panel, let alone comprehend the intricate, hyper-complex variables of cardiovascular algorithmic sequencing. So I built a trap tailored exactly to her profound ignorance and their blinding greed. 3 nights ago, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of my dual monitors in my cramped apartment, I wrote a hidden subroutine deep beneath the standard user interface. I called it the right protocol. On the surface, the algorithm performed perfectly. It processed historical patient data and generated beautiful, colorful, predictive graphs with breathtaking accuracy. It was exactly the kind of shiny, superficial presentation that would dazzle a room full of arrogant, old-money investors who only cared about profit margins. But beneath that polished surface, I embedded a localized logic bomb. It was a sophisticated data watermark, disguised as a routine calibration check. It was programmed to remain entirely dormant during basic walkthroughs and slideshow presentations. However, the exact moment the software was forced to run a live high-stress diagnostic simulation, the specific demonstration that elite medical boards and federal regulators demand before finalizing a patent, the code would execute a catastrophic, cascading failure. It would not simply crash to a black screen. It was designed to lock the entire operating system globally. The software would freeze, and it would project a very specific string of text across every single connected monitor in the room. It would display my full legal name, my grandmother's original medical patent registry numbers, and an undeniable encrypted digital timestamp proving the exact millisecond the data was stolen from my secure hospital terminal. Brianna had proudly copied a Trojan horse onto her diamond-encrusted flash drive, and she was carrying it straight into the heart of the Spencer family empire. Back in the executive suite, my dramatic exit had accomplished exactly what I calculated it would. Instead of raising red flags, Marcus aggressively firing me only solidified his reputation in Richard Spencer's eyes. Old money billionaires inherently respect ruthlessness. Richard saw my father as a powerful, decisive man, willing to protect his corporate assets at any cost. With the inconvenient, supposedly unstable sister physically removed from the premises by security, Brianna was completely free to resume her fraudulent performance. She clicked through the colorful slides I had built. She recited the memorized hollow script my parents had undoubtedly drilled into her head all week. She spoke passionately about revolutionizing aortic valve replacements and reducing surgical mortality rates using complex medical terminology she did not actually understand. Because she possessed the highly coveted, recently purchased Johns Hopkins residency acceptance, the Spencers assumed her medical credentials were unimpeachable. They completely bypassed standard technical due diligence. They did not bring in independent software engineers to verify the underlying code. They relied entirely on the fabricated Sterling family prestige, the shiny presentation, and their own blinding greed. The atmosphere in this boardroom was electric, with the promise of a multi-billion-dollar monopoly. Richard Spencer saw an opportunity to control the next generation of cardiovascular surgery. He ordered his legal team to draft the preliminary funding agreements right there at the glass table. Before the catered breakfast was even cleared away, the Spencer Investment Group authorized the immediate transfer of $10 million into a newly formed joint venture account. They formally bought into the lie. But Marcus and Vivian could not simply let the Spencers buy the algorithm outright. To maintain their facade of equal financial power and to secure the family merger before the high society wedding, they had to provide a matching capital investment. They had to prove they were billionaires too. Sitting in my quiet apartment later that evening, my secure smartphone buzzed against the kitchen counter. It was an encrypted message from Elias Thorne. He had been actively monitoring the offshore shell accounts in real time. Marcus and Vivian had just made their final fatal move. Desperate to match the $10 million Spencer investment and solidify their elite status, my parents had panicked. They liquidated the absolute last remaining high-yield assets inside the Wright Medical Trust. They drained every single offshore shell company, emptied the accounts they had spent a decade hiding, and wired the entire sum directly into the joint corporate escrow account with the Spencers. They were now completely irrevocably exposed. Elias called me 5 minutes later, his voice ringing with cold satisfaction. He told me that every stolen dime my parents possessed was now legally locked inside a highly scrutinized, federally regulated corporate merger. The money was trapped. The federal wire fraud was officially cemented in interstate banking records, and the Spencers were now unwitting accomplices in the laundering of a stolen inheritance. My parents had just mortgaged their entire fake empire on Brianna's ability to operate a complex surgical algorithm she could not even spell. They had pushed all their stolen chips into the center of the table, entirely convinced they had won the ultimate prize. I walked over to my closet and opened the door. I reached into the back and pulled out the cheap black blazer covered in jagged orange bleach stains. I ran my fingers over the ruined fabric. Spencer had thrown $500 at me, telling me to buy a new jacket so I would not embarrass his family at the upcoming events. He told me to stay out of their way while they celebrated their brilliance. I smiled, dropping the blazer onto my bed. Spencer and Brianna's lavish country club engagement party was scheduled for the coming weekend. The entire Atlanta elite would be there to toast the new power couple and celebrate their groundbreaking medical joint venture. They expected me to be hiding in shame, entirely defeated and broken. They expected me to disappear. Instead, I was going to walk right through the front doors of that exclusive country club. I was going to look my sister in the eyes, hand her a ticking time bomb, and watch the countdown begin. The Peachtree Elite Country Club was a towering monument to exclusionary wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a heavy golden glow over the grand ballroom. Waiters in pristine white gloves carried silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. This was the fortress where the Spencer family had reigned supreme for generations, and tonight it was the stage for their lucrative alliance with the Sterling family. I walked up the sweeping marble staircase toward the arched mahogany doors. I was not wearing the bleached blazer today. I wore a tailored emerald green gown that I had found at a vintage boutique years ago. I had altered it myself to fit my frame perfectly. I did not need $1 million budget or a brand new sports car to command attention. I only needed the absolute certainty that I was holding the match that would burn this entire room to the ground. The moment I stepped onto the ballroom floor, the heavy scent of expensive perfume and blooming lilies hit me. Across the room, Brianna was holding court. She wore a custom white silk gown, covered in thousands of hand-sewn pearls. A massive diamond glittered on her left hand as she laughed loudly at a joke someone made. Spencer stood right beside her, looking appropriately possessive and utterly arrogant. Marcus and Vivian hovered just a few feet away, practically vibrating with desperate, social climbing energy. They were shaking hands with hospital executives and hedge fund managers, selling the illusion of their brilliant, successful family. It took exactly 40 seconds for my mother to notice me. I watched her perfectly curated high society smile instantly freeze. Her eyes widened in sheer unadulterated panic. She tapped Marcus on the shoulder, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. The blood drained from my father's face. He whispered something to Vivian, and the two of them broke away from their wealthy investors, marching across the ballroom floor. Vivian did not walk. She stalked. She cut through the crowd of billionaires and surgeons with ruthless, terrified purpose. When she reached me, she grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my bare skin. She pulled me toward a shadowed alcove near the coat check, her voice a toxic, frantic whisper. She demanded to know how I got past the front gate security. She told me I had completely lost my mind if I thought I could show up here after being fired and humiliate them in front of the Spencer family. Marcus appeared right behind her, stepping close to use his physical size to intimidate me. He signaled sharply to two massive security guards stationed by the entrance doors. He told me I had exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out the door before he had me dragged out by my hair. He reminded me that Richard Spencer owned half of this club, and they would absolutely not tolerate a deranged, jealous sister ruining their perfect evening. He leaned down and hissed that my desperate attempt for attention was pathetic, and my presence was an insult to the elite people in this room. I did not pull my arm away. I looked down at my mother's hand gripping my skin, then up into my father's furious, panicked eyes. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. Before the security guards could take another step toward me, a deep, commanding voice echoed from right behind my shoulder. The voice politely asked Marcus to unhand his guest immediately. Vivian gasped and dropped my arm as if she had been burned. Marcus spun around, the aggressive scowl instantly dropping from his face. Dr. Montgomery stepped forward out of the shadows, looking immaculate in a classic black tuxedo. Dr. Montgomery was not just the dean of admissions at Johns Hopkins. In the elite medical circles of Atlanta, his name commanded absolute reverence. He served on the board of directors for 3 major research hospitals that the Spencer Investment Group actively courted for exclusive contracts. He possessed the exact kind of untouchable intellectual prestige that Marcus and Vivian spent their entire lives desperately trying to buy. He looked at my parents with an expression of profound, quiet disgust. He informed them that I was attending the gala as his exclusive +1. He looked Marcus directly in the eye and asked if there was a problem with his personal guest list. My parents were completely trapped. They were standing in front of Atlanta high society, fully aware that Dr. Montgomery held Brianna's fraudulent residency acceptance in his hands. If they caused a scene, or if they dared to disrespect him, he could destroy their medical facade in a single sentence. Marcus swallowed hard, forcing a tight, incredibly fake smile onto his face. He waved the security guards away with a trembling hand. He told the dean it was a simple misunderstanding and welcomed him to the celebration. Vivian was physically shaking with suppressed rage. She forced a rigid nod, unable to even formulate a coherent sentence before grabbing Marcus by the arm and dragging him back toward the safety of the VIP tables. Dr. Montgomery offered me his arm. He told me the trap was set perfectly, and it was time to let them feel the heat. We walked right into the center of the ballroom, parting the crowd of billionaires and socialites effortlessly. I caught Brianna's eye from across the room. She was gripping Spencer's arm, her face going completely pale as she watched me glide through the room on the arm of the very man who controlled her fake medical future. She was terrified, but she still believed she held the winning hand with that stolen algorithm. She had absolutely no idea that I had brought her a very special engagement gift. Dr. Montgomery released my arm with a subtle, encouraging nod. He stepped back toward the champagne fountain, allowing me to take the floor entirely on my own. I walked the remaining 20 yards toward the center of the ballroom with slow, deliberate precision. Every step I took in my emerald gown felt like a masterclass in psychological warfare. I kept my posture impossibly straight, and my expression radiating warm, sisterly joy. To the dozens of wealthy investors and high society photographers milling around the room, I looked like a proud family member coming to offer my heartfelt congratulations. Brianna watched me approach with eyes wide like a cornered animal. She instinctively tightened her grip on Spencer's arm. Spencer puffed out his chest, stepping slightly in front of her to act as a physical shield. The arrogant smirk returned to his face, completely ignorant of the sheer terror radiating from the woman standing next to him. He leaned down as I stopped in front of them. He kept his voice low so the nearby hospital executives would not hear his venom. He asked me how much money I had to drain from my pathetic bank account to rent a dress that made me look like I actually belonged in the same room as his family. He told me that my little stunt with the dean of admissions was a cute parlor trick, but it changed absolutely nothing. He bragged that the Spencer Investment Group had just successfully wired $10 million into the joint venture account that morning. He said the Sterling and Spencer families were officially merged in business, and there was nothing a bitter, fired research assistant could do to stop their inevitable domination of the medical technology sector. I did not break my polite, radiant smile. I looked Spencer directly in the eyes and congratulated him on his massive financial commitment. I told him he was making a highly educational investment in his future. Spencer scoffed, clearly confused by my calm demeanor. He opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but I smoothly shifted my attention away from him and focused entirely on my sister. Brianna was physically trembling. Her flawless makeup could not hide the sudden sickly pallor of her skin. She knew exactly what I was capable of in a laboratory, and she knew I would never walk into a room full of her billionaire investors just to offer a polite greeting. She was bracing for an explosion. She expected me to scream, to throw a drink, to loudly accuse her of theft right there on the dance floor. I did none of those things. Instead, I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown. I pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. I had taken the time to wrap a very thin blood-red silk ribbon around the center of the metal casing, tying it into a perfect little bow. I held the small device out to her, resting it on the flat of my palm. Brianna stared at the silver drive as if I were offering her a live grenade. She refused to reach out, her hands remained frozen at her sides. Spencer looked down at the object, his brow furrowing in irritation. He demanded to know what kind of childish game I was playing. I kept my eyes locked on Brianna. I spoke with a loud, cheerful voice designed to carry to the nearby photographers. I told her I could not possibly let her celebrate her engagement without bringing a special gift to commemorate her massive career milestone. I took a step closer, grabbed her rigid hand, and firmly pressed the cold metal flash drive right into her palm. I closed her trembling fingers over it. Then I leaned in. I moved so close that the side of my face brushed against her cheek. I arranged my features into a picture of absolute adoring sisterly affection for the cameras flashing a few feet away. But my voice dropped into a terrifying razor-sharp whisper directly into her ear. I told her I knew exactly what she stole from my workstation. I told her I knew she had presented my cardiovascular algorithm to the Spencer family board that morning, and I knew she was currently riding high on a wave of stolen genius. But then I let the absolute horror of reality sink into her brain. I whispered that the algorithm she currently possessed was fatally corrupted. I explained that the artificial intelligence modeling she stole contained a massive, deeply embedded mathematical anomaly within the aortic pressure variables. I told her it was a localized data fault line that would completely crash the entire predictive sequence the second it was run through a live diagnostic simulation. I made sure to use heavy, complex clinical terminology that I knew she completely lacked the education to understand. I wanted her to feel profoundly stupid and hopelessly out of her depth. I pulled back just an inch, maintaining my bright smile for the crowd while delivering the final crushing blow. I looked deep into her terrified eyes and whispered the exact words that would haunt her every waking moment. I hope you are smart enough to fix it before you kill a patient and lose Spencer's $10 million. I stepped away from her, smoothing the skirt of my emerald gown. Brianna looked like she was going to be physically sick. The blood had completely drained from her lips. She looked down at the silver flash drive clenched in her shaking fist, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She knew she could not code a basic HTML web page, let alone reverse engineer, and patch a corrupted cardiovascular algorithm. She knew that if she took that software into a clinical setting, it would fail catastrophically. And she knew that when it failed, the Spencer family would instantly realize they had just thrown $10 million into a worthless, fraudulent scam. She would lose the wedding, the money, the prestige, and her entirely fabricated medical career in a single afternoon. Spencer noticed her sudden, severe panic. He put a hand on her shoulder, demanding to know what I had just said to her. He glared at me, asking if I had just threatened his fiancée. I let out a soft, melodic laugh that carried beautifully over the string quartet playing in the background. I told Spencer I had simply given my sister a backup copy of some critical research notes she might have missed during her busy schedule. I told him I was just being a supportive family member, ensuring she had all the tools she needed to succeed in her very difficult, highly technical new role. I looked back at Brianna one last time. She was staring at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and paralyzing fear. The power dynamic had completely shifted. She was standing in a room full of people who worshipped her, wearing a dress that cost thousands of dollars, holding the arm of a billionaire heir. Yet in that exact moment, she had never been more powerless. She was trapped inside a burning building, and I had just handed her the only map to the exit written in a language she could not read. I offered them both a polite, graceful nod. I wished them a wonderfully memorable engagement party. Then I turned my back on the golden couple of Atlanta society and walked away. As I moved back through the crowded ballroom to rejoin Dr. Montgomery, I did not need to look over my shoulder to know the absolute chaos I had just unleashed. Brianna was going to spend the rest of her lavish engagement party drowning in a silent, suffocating panic attack. She was going to smile for the cameras while her mind raced frantically, trying to figure out how to hide a fatal software glitch from a team of ruthless corporate investors. She was going to drag Marcus and Vivian into her paranoia, forcing my parents to realize that their massive $10 million gamble was resting on a foundation of corrupted data. The trap was fully armed. I had planted the seed of total destruction right in the palm of her hand. Now all I had to do was wait for them to tear each other apart, trying to fix a problem they were never smart enough to solve. The fallout happened exactly as I predicted, unfolding with a rapid, violent desperation. By Tuesday morning, my phone began vibrating with a relentless stream of frantic notifications from former colleagues who were still working inside the Cardiovascular Institute. Brianna had taken the corrupted flash drive straight to a team of highly expensive outsourced software developers. She paid them triple their hourly rate to crack the encrypted files and fix the anomaly I had warned her about at the engagement party. But my code was a labyrinth of advanced cardiovascular mathematics combined with localized security protocols. It was a digital fortress built by someone who actually understood the science of the human heart. Her hired developers hit an absolute brick wall. They could not patch a highly specialized surgical algorithm without knowing how the underlying medical data actually functioned. The Spencer Investment Group had scheduled a mandatory independent technical review of the software for the upcoming Monday. Brianna was completely out of time and completely out of options. She had broken down in hysterics inside her glass office, finally forced to confess to Marcus and Vivian that the $10 million corporate merger was about to explode in their faces. She admitted that the software was frozen, the data was corrupted, and she had no idea how to present the project to her future father-in-law without looking like a total fraud. I was sitting at the small, wobbly laminate table in my tiny apartment when the heavy, aggressive pounding started on my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, violent hammering of people who were watching their entire fraudulent empire collapse in real time. I did not rush. I slowly stood up, pulled my smartphone from my pocket, opened the voice memo application, and hit the red record button. I slipped the device into the front pocket of my jeans, making sure the microphone was completely unobstructed. I walked over to the thin wooden door and unbolted the deadbolt. Marcus and Vivian pushed their way into my cramped living space before I even had the door fully open. The polished high society facade they wore at the country club was entirely gone. Vivian looked haggard. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled, her makeup was smeared, and her eyes were wide with a manic, desperate energy. Marcus was practically shaking with rage, his face a dark, dangerous shade of red. They looked around my cheap apartment with sheer disgust, but their arrogance was heavily laced with undeniable, suffocating panic. Marcus slammed his heavy hand against my flimsy wall, demanding the decryption keys and the clean source code immediately. He screamed that Brianna was having a nervous breakdown in her bedroom because the Spencer Tech auditors were demanding access to the predictive modeling software by the end of the week. He ordered me to sit down at my computer, fix the data watermark I had maliciously planted, and hand over the functional algorithm before I ruined the most important business deal in the history of the Sterling family. I stood perfectly still, crossing my arms over my chest. I looked my father dead in the eyes and asked him why I would ever lift a single finger to save a medical presentation that did not belong to my sister. I kept my voice incredibly calm, intentionally lowering my volume to force them to listen closely. I stated plainly that the cardiovascular research was my proprietary property, built over 3 years of grueling clinical trials, and Brianna had absolutely no right to sell it to the Spencer Investment Group. Vivian stepped forward, her voice shrill and hysterical. She told me to stop being a selfish, vindictive brat. She claimed I owed my sister this research because I had been a massive financial burden on the family for my entire life. She ordered me to fix the code right this second, promising that if I obeyed, they might consider throwing a few $1,000s my way after the Spencer merger was finalized. She said I could use the money to move out of this pathetic, depressing slum. I let out a sharp, mocking laugh. I looked directly at Vivian and told her I did not need a few $1,000s of Spencer money. I asked her why she was offering me pocket change when she and Marcus had just drained millions of dollars from the Wright Medical Trust. I deliberately threw the accusation into the center of the room, knowing exactly how Marcus reacted when his absolute authority was challenged by someone he considered beneath him. The bait worked flawlessly. Marcus lost whatever tiny shred of self-control he had left. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, towering over me to use his physical size as intimidation. His voice echoed off the thin walls of my apartment. He screamed that every single dollar in that trust fund belonged to him because he was the one who built the Sterling family reputation. I explicitly stated that forging my signature to funnel $2 million into Johns Hopkins was the smartest investment he had ever made because it bought Brianna a medical career that I was too pathetic to achieve. He bragged that my grandmother was a fool for leaving her patent royalties to a weak, ungrateful child, and he was simply correcting her mistake by taking the money for himself. I did not step back. I pushed him further, maintaining my cold, unwavering stare. I asked him if stealing my inheritance was not enough. I asked him to confirm right there to my face that he used his power as a hospital donor to fire me specifically so Brianna could steal my intellectual property without any interference. Marcus sneered, his chest heaving with exertion. He loudly and clearly admitted to all of it. He bragged that he had the lab director completely in his pocket. He confessed that Brianna taking my algorithm was not theft, but a rightful transfer of assets to the more capable, socially acceptable daughter. He told me that my brain, my research, and my grandmother's money were nothing but raw materials for him to use to build his own empire. He pointed a thick, heavy finger right at my face and threatened to hire thugs to destroy my apartment and physically drag me to a computer terminal if I did not hand over the clean code immediately. He explicitly yelled that he owned my research, he owned my trust fund, and he owned me. I let his violent, echoing confession hang in the air for 5 long seconds. The smartphone in my pocket had captured every single crystal-clear syllable. The federal wire fraud, the intellectual property theft, the forged medical trust documents, and now explicit physical threats and extortion. It was an absolute masterpiece of self-incrimination. They had walked right into my home and handed me the final, irrefutable pieces of evidence required to lock them in a federal penitentiary for the rest of their lives. I looked at the 2 sweating, desperate people standing in my cheap living room. I smiled a slow, chilling smile. I calmly informed them that I would not be fixing the algorithm. I told them Brianna was going to have to face the Spencer Investment Board completely on her own, armed with nothing but her fake residency and her profound stupidity. I pointed to the open front door and commanded them to get out of my apartment before I called the police for criminal trespassing. Marcus raised his hand as if he wanted to strike me across the face, but something in my dead, fearless expression made him freeze. I was not the terrified scapegoat they had bullied for a decade. I was looking at them like they were already ghosts. Vivian grabbed his arm, pulling him back, realizing they were wasting time they did not have. They stormed out into the hallway, Marcus shouting over his shoulder that he would completely destroy me by morning, promising that I would beg for their mercy when he was done with me. I closed the door smoothly and locked the heavy metal deadbolt. I pulled my phone from my pocket and hit stop on the recording. I uploaded the pristine audio file directly to Elias Thorne. The trap was locked, sealed, and ready to be delivered to the federal authorities. The Sterling family was officially out of time. The Woodruff Arts Center in downtown Atlanta had been completely transformed to host the most lucrative corporate marriage of the decade. The Sterling and Spencer families had rented out the entire main atrium for the official signing gala of their joint medical venture. It was a staggering display of unearned wealth. Massive floral arrangements cascaded down the sweeping white staircases. Waiters navigated through a sea of billionaires, hedge fund managers, elite medical board directors, and aggressive financial journalists. Every major news outlet in the city had sent a reporter to cover the $20 million merger that promised to revolutionize cardiovascular surgery. Marcus and Vivian were in their absolute element. They were floating through the crowd with crystal champagne flutes, soaking up the admiration and envy of Atlanta high society. They believed they had won. They believed that terrifying me in my apartment had successfully silenced me. Vivian was wearing a custom couture gown, laughing loudly at a joke told by Richard Spencer. Marcus was clapping wealthy investors on the back, selling the flawless illusion of his brilliant, philanthropic family empire. Brianna stood near the center stage, but her performance was severely cracking. She was wearing a diamond necklace that likely cost more than my college tuition, yet she looked as though she were walking to her own execution. Her skin was incredibly pale, and she kept taking quick, shallow sips of her drink. She knew the algorithm resting on the presentation computer was completely corrupted. She knew she was standing on a trapdoor. But the greed of my parents and the ruthless pressure from the Spencer family had forced her into this room. She was entirely trapped by the lie she had stolen. I did not walk through the front doors to be stopped by their hired security. I entered through the subterranean service corridors. Elias Thorne had used his extensive federal connections to secure me a temporary vendor access pass. I bypassed the main ballroom entirely and took the service elevator straight up to the audiovisual control booth that overlooked the grand atrium. The lone technician sitting in the booth looked up in surprise as I walked in. I handed him a signed, highly official-looking non-disclosure agreement drafted by Elias, along with a crisp $100 bill. I told him I was the lead software engineer for the Sterling Medical Project, and I needed to personally monitor the data feed for the upcoming presentation to ensure compliance. The technician did not ask a single question. He took the money, stepped aside, and allowed me to plug my personal, heavily encrypted laptop directly into the main projection mainframe. I stood in the darkened booth and looked out through the soundproof glass at the glittering crowd below. The main stage was set with a long, polished glass table. Two ceremonial gold pens rested beside a thick stack of legal contracts. Behind the table, three massive digital projection screens displayed the newly designed sleek logo of the Spencer Sterling Medical Initiative. A hush fell over the enormous crowd as Richard Spencer walked up the steps and took his place at the podium. The journalists instantly raised their cameras. The billionaire patriarch gripped the edges of the podium, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. He welcomed the elite guests, bragging about his family's long history of dominating the financial markets. He proudly announced that tonight, the Spencer Investment Group was committing an initial $10 million to fund a revolutionary cardiovascular algorithm. He spoke about Brianna as if she were a generational medical prodigy, praising the Sterling family for producing such a brilliant, dedicated surgeon. Richard Spencer then invited Marcus to the stage to officially sign the joint venture agreements. My father practically sprinted up the stairs. He took his place at the podium looking out over the sea of wealthy investors with pure, unfiltered arrogance. Marcus launched into a deeply sickening, fabricated speech about family values. He told the crowd that he and Vivian had sacrificed everything to support their daughter's dreams. He claimed that this $20 million merger was the culmination of their lifelong dedication to medical advancement and Black excellence. He lied directly to the faces of the most powerful people in Georgia, soaking up their applause like a starving man. I locked the heavy metal door of the control booth. I routed my laptop through the master audio-visual console, seizing total administrative control over the massive screens and the sound system. I left my laptop running the bypass sequence and walked out of the booth. I moved down the sweeping spiral staircase that connected the mezzanine to the main floor. I was not wearing a cheap stained blazer today. I was wearing a stark, perfectly tailored white suit. It was a deliberate choice. It was the color of absolute clinical precision, and it was the exact color of the pristine, unbleached fabric they had tried to destroy. Marcus picked up the ceremonial gold pen. Richard Spencer picked up his. The photographers surged forward, their camera flashes illuminating the stage like a lightning storm. Brianna and Spencer stood right behind their fathers, smiling for the front page of the Financial Times. They were exactly 3 seconds away from signing the binding federal contracts. I did not hesitate. I reached into my pocket and pressed a single button on a remote wireless trigger I had synced to the control booth. Instantly, the booming, triumphant background music cut off. The audio feed to Marcus' microphone went completely dead. The sudden jarring silence caused the entire ballroom of investors and journalists to freeze. I walked straight down the center aisle, my white suit cutting through the sea of dark tuxedos and evening gowns. The crowd naturally parted for me, sensing the profound, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Marcus looked up from the contracts, his pen hovering just an inch above the signature line. He saw me walking toward the stage. The arrogant, victorious smile on his face completely collapsed. Vivian let out a sharp, audible gasp from the front row. Brianna took a physical step backward, bumping into Spencer, her eyes widening in absolute terror. I walked up the 5 short steps onto the main stage. The security guards standing by the wings hesitated, unsure of what to do. I was dressed flawlessly, walking with total authority, and the room was packed with relentless journalists. Marcus could not order his guards to drag me away without causing a massive, highly publicized physical altercation right in front of the press. He was completely trapped by the very audience he had invited to witness his triumph. I walked directly to the podium. I did not look at my father. I reached out and took the heavy microphone right out of its stand. Marcus stepped into my path, his face turning a dangerous, violent shade of purple. He kept his back to the audience, leaning down, so only I could hear him. He hissed through clenched teeth, demanding to know what I was doing. He threatened to end my life if I ruined this deal. I smiled, a cold, entirely fearless smile. I looked him dead in the eyes and whispered that he was already out of time. I stepped around him, bringing the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed with crystal-clear authority across the massive, silent atrium. I did not introduce myself as the troubled, jealous sister they had spent years gossiping about. I welcomed the elite medical boards, the Spencer family, and the press to the event. I introduced myself as Zora Wright Sterling. I announced clearly and firmly that I was the sole legal beneficiary of the Wright Medical Trust. I stated that I was the lead clinical researcher at the Atlanta Cardiovascular Institute, and most importantly, I declared that I was the sole exclusive architect and owner of the cardiovascular algorithm they were currently attempting to purchase. A wave of shocked murmurs ripped through the crowd of billionaires. Camera flashes exploded in my direction. Richard Spencer dropped his gold pen onto the glass table, his sharp eyes darting from me to Marcus in deep, angry confusion. Spencer stepped forward aggressively, demanding that the venue security remove the insane woman from the stage immediately. I did not flinch. I raised my voice, cutting through Spencer's arrogant command. I told the room that they were currently witnessing an active $20 million attempt at corporate espionage and federal wire fraud. I announced that the Sterling family did not own a single line of the code they were attempting to sell, and the medical data they were presenting was completely fundamentally fraudulent. Vivian screamed from the front row, shouting that I was a pathological liar who had escaped from a psychiatric facility. Marcus reached out to grab my arm, desperate to physically pull me away from the microphone. But I was faster. I hit the second button on my wireless remote. The three massive digital screens behind the stage went entirely black. The Spencer Sterling logo vanished. The stage was set, the audience was captivated, and I was holding the detonator to the greatest financial execution in the history of Atlanta high society. I turned my back to my horrified parents and looked directly at the giant blank screens, ready to show the world exactly what a stolen legacy looked like when it was burned to ashes. I pressed the wireless trigger one more time. The three massive digital screens behind me flared back to life, but they no longer displayed the sleek corporate logo of the joint venture. Instead, the high-definition projectors illuminated the grand atrium with stark, undeniably authentic legal documents. On the center screen was a highly magnified side-by-side comparison of two distinct signatures. One was my legitimate signature pulled directly from my state-issued identification. The other was the signature from the $2 million Johns Hopkins philanthropic pledge. I pointed directly at the glowing screens and spoke with absolute clinical detachment. I informed the room of elite investors and hungry journalists that they were currently looking at a textbook example of federal wire fraud and felony forgery. I walked across the stage, my crisp white suit catching the bright venue lights. I explained with surgical precision how my parents had illegally bypassed a federally protected trust fund established by the late Dr. Josephine Wright. I displayed the offshore banking transfers, the shell company routing numbers, and the exact paper trail Elias Thorne had compiled. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless cry from the front row. She covered her face with her hands, realizing that her entire high society facade was currently being broadcast as a criminal indictment to the exact people she spent her life trying to impress. Marcus lunged forward desperately, trying to yank the microphone cord from the podium, but my wireless setup rendered his frantic, aggressive efforts completely useless. He stood there on the main stage of the Woodruff Arts Center, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like a prison uniform. I was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public exposure. I turned my attention directly to Richard Spencer. The billionaire patriarch had not moved a single muscle since I took the stage. His cold, calculating eyes were locked onto the projection screens, his brilliant financial mind rapidly absorbing the damning data. I looked at him and delivered the absolute worst news a ruthless investor could ever hear. I told him that the $10 million his firm had wired into the joint venture account that very morning was now legally trapped. I explained that because his funds were actively commingled with my stolen inheritance, the entire escrow account had been subjected to a sealed federal freezing order. I watched the horrifying realization hit him like a physical blow. His massive investment was paralyzed in an active racketeering investigation, and my parents had used his family to launder their stolen money. But I was far from finished. I had promised them a total execution, and I was going to deliver it flawlessly. I clicked the remote in my hand once again. The legal documents vanished from the screens, replaced instantly by the complex, colorful, predictive graphs of the cardiovascular algorithm Brianna had presented earlier that morning. I looked down at my sister. She was trembling so violently that the expensive diamonds around her neck shook, catching the stage lights in erratic flashes. I told the captivated audience that Marcus and Vivian stealing my money was only half the crime. The true danger, I explained, was standing right next to Spencer. I pointed directly at Brianna. I declared that she was a complete medical fraud who had stolen my proprietary research to secure her residency and legitimize this corporate merger. Spencer instantly stepped in front of Brianna, his face twisted in aristocratic fury. He shouted that I was a deranged, jealous liar. He pointed aggressively at the screens and loudly defended his fiancée, claiming that Brianna had spent years developing that algorithm in the laboratory. Brianna, desperate to save her crumbling future and secure her billionaire lifestyle, finally found her voice. She screamed that I was an incompetent assistant who had been fired for attempting to steal her brilliant work. She yelled to the crowd of medical board directors that the hospital administration had already confirmed her absolute ownership of the project. I smiled. It was the exact predictable response I needed to spring the final trap. I looked at Richard Spencer and offered him a simple, devastating proposition. I told him that if Brianna truly wrote the complex code displayed on those screens, she should have no problem running a live high-stress diagnostic simulation right here in front of the medical board. I stepped away from the podium, gesturing openly to the presentation laptop resting on the polished glass table. I invited my sister to step up, execute the primary diagnostic sequence, and prove my accusations completely false. The entire ballroom fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. The journalists stopped shouting questions, their cameras trained entirely on the golden couple. Richard Spencer turned slowly to Brianna. He did not ask her to run the test. He commanded her to execute the simulation immediately. Brianna looked at the sleek laptop as if it were a loaded weapon. She took a hesitant, terrified step forward, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She knew the code was fatally corrupted. She knew her hired developers had failed to crack my encryption. But she had absolutely no way out. The billionaire backing her fake career was demanding proof of her genius. With tears of pure panic welling in her eyes, she stepped up to the glass table. She placed her trembling fingers on the trackpad, navigated to the simulation menu, and clicked the execution command. The massive digital screens behind us shifted. The software initiated the simulation. For 3 agonizing seconds, the colorful cardiovascular graphs pulsed with life. Spencer smirked, letting out a loud breath, entirely convinced they had won the confrontation. Then the trap snapped shut with devastating force. The mathematical sequence hit the hidden fault line I had coded deep into the aortic pressure variables. A loud, sharp error tone blasted through the venue sound system, echoing violently off the high ceilings. The beautiful, colorful graphs instantly shattered into fragmented, corrupted pixels. The entire operating system locked in a catastrophic failure. The 3 massive screens flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson red, casting an eerie, bloody glow over the entire stage. Across the crimson displays, bold white text began to scroll automatically. It bypassed every single security protocol the outsourced developers had tried to build. The text did not display medical data. It displayed the unassailable truth. The massive letters read, "Primary Architect, Zora Wright Sterling, Original Patent Registry, Dr. Josephine Wright." Below my name, a highly encrypted, undeniable digital timestamp flashed in real time for the entire room to see. It showed the exact date, the precise hour, and the specific millisecond. The data was illicitly copied from my secure hospital terminal to Brianna's flash drive. The watermark was absolute, incontrovertible proof of digital theft, embedded so deeply into the foundation of the code that it could never be erased or denied. The entire algorithm was a verified, documented stolen asset. I walked back to the center of the stage, the crimson light bathing my white suit in a harsh, dramatic glow. I picked up the microphone and looked directly at the elite medical board members sitting in the front row. I asked them if they truly wanted to grant a prestigious surgical residency to a woman who just attempted to commercialize a fatally corrupted algorithm she could not even comprehend. I asked them how many innocent patients would have died on the operating table because Brianna Sterling cared more about securing a billionaire husband than understanding the basic mathematics of the human heart. The flash of the cameras intensified into a blinding strobe. The reporters began shouting questions, the noise swelling into a chaotic roar. Brianna stood frozen at the glass table, staring at her own public execution, written in giant white letters across the red screens. She had tried to steal my mind to build her empire, and I had just used my mind to burn her fake kingdom to the ground. The chaotic roar of the journalists abruptly died down as Richard Spencer moved. The billionaire patriarch did not shout. He did not wave his hands or display an ounce of the frantic, desperate energy consuming my parents. He simply turned away from the glowing crimson screens and locked his cold, furious gaze entirely on his son. Spencer was visibly trembling. The arrogant, untouchable heir to the Spencer Investment Group suddenly looked like a terrified child. He held his hands up defensively, stammering out a pathetic stream of excuses. He swore to his father that he had no idea the algorithm was stolen. He claimed Brianna had deceived him, that my parents had falsified the investment portfolios, and that he was completely innocent of any failure in due diligence. Richard did not let him finish his cowardly explanation. The billionaire raised his right hand and delivered a sharp, devastating slap directly across Spencer's face. The physical crack of skin striking skin echoed like a gunshot through the silent, massive atrium. Spencer stumbled backward, clutching his reddened cheek in absolute shock. The elite crowd of hospital executives and hedge fund managers gasped in unison. Richard stepped directly into his son's personal space. His voice, a low, lethal growl that carried through the high-definition microphones still active on the stage. He told Spencer that he was an absolute disgrace to their family name. He stated that allowing a fraudulent, socially desperate family of criminals to blind him with a fake medical residency was the single greatest financial failure in the history of their firm. Richard coldly announced right in front of the flashing cameras that Spencer was officially stripped of his executive title and removed from the board of directors effective immediately. Then Richard turned his razor-sharp attention to Brianna. She shrank away from him, her custom pearl gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Richard looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He declared that the upcoming high society wedding was permanently canceled. He commanded her to take off the Spencer family engagement ring right this second and leave it on the glass table. He explicitly stated that if she ever attempted to contact his son or approach their family estate again, he would personally ensure she spent the rest of her miserable life drowning in civil litigation. Brianna sobbed, her hands shaking violently as she slid the massive diamond off her finger and dropped it onto the polished glass. It landed with a hollow, pathetic clink. Richard was not finished. The true wrath of a billionaire investor scorned was a terrifying force of nature, and he immediately aimed it directly at Marcus. My father was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo clinging to his rigid, terrified frame. He raised his hands in a desperate, placating gesture, begging Richard to step into a private office to discuss a reimbursement strategy. Marcus frantically promised to liquidate his commercial real estate assets, to sign over the deed to the Buckhead mansion, and to do whatever it took to make the $10 million investment whole again. Richard let out a dark, humorless laugh that sent a chill through the ballroom. He told Marcus that his fake commercial real estate assets were already locked under a federal freezing order, thanks to his brilliant, legitimate daughter standing on the stage. Richard promised my father that he was going to deploy his entire army of corporate litigators to tear the Sterling family apart. He swore to seize every remaining asset, every vehicle, and every single piece of jewelry Vivian was currently wearing. He told Marcus that by the time the civil courts were done with him, he would not even be able to afford a cardboard box to sleep in. Before Marcus could utter another pathetic plea for mercy, the heavy brass doors at the back of the atrium swung wide open. The absolute authority of the federal government had finally arrived. Elias Thorne strode into the ballroom looking sharp and immaculate in a dark charcoal suit. He walked with the calm, terrifying confidence of a man who held all the winning cards. Flanking him were 6 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI printed clearly across their backs. The crowd of wealthy elites parted instantly, clearing a wide, unobstructed path from the entrance directly to the front row where my parents stood. Elias stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at me. He gave me a single respectful nod, confirming that the offshore bank ledgers I had photographed inside my father's safe had provided the exact ammunition required to secure the arrest warrants. The trap was completely sealed. The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of folded legal documents from his jacket. He looked directly at Marcus and Vivian. In a loud, commanding voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation, he announced that they were officially under arrest. He listed the federal charges for the entire room of journalists to record: wire fraud, grand larceny, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, identity theft, and the illegal misappropriation of a federally protected medical trust fund. Vivian completely lost whatever tiny shred of sanity she had left. As 2 agents moved in with heavy steel handcuffs, my mother began screaming hysterically. She flailed her arms, striking one of the agents in the chest, desperately trying to protect her couture gown from their grip. She shouted to the crowd of stunned billionaires that she was an elite member of Atlanta high society, She demanded that someone call the mayor, insisting that people of her social standing did not get arrested like common criminals. She cried out that she was a beloved philanthropist and a dedicated mother who was just trying to build a beautiful life for her family. The federal agents did not care about her country club memberships or her designer clothes. They grabbed her arms, twisting them firmly behind her back. The sharp mechanical click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly over her frantic screams. The illusion of her perfect, untouchable life was completely shattered. She was dragged away in tears, her expensive high heels dragging across the polished floor. Marcus did not fight back. The reality of his total annihilation had broken his spirit entirely. As the agents secured his wrists in metal cuffs, his shoulders slumped forward. The towering, intimidating patriarch who had threatened to destroy my life just hours ago was reduced to a hollow, pathetic shell. He looked up at me one last time as the agents turned him toward the exit. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I maintained my cold, unwavering stare, watching silently as the men who had terrorized me for a decade were marched out of the Woodruff Arts Center in absolute disgrace. The ballroom was completely silent, save for the rapid clicking of camera shutters capturing the incredible downfall of the Sterling family empire. Richard Spencer turned on his heel, signaled to his humiliated son, and marched out of the venue, flanked by his own security detail. The wealthy investors and medical board directors quickly followed suit, eager to distance themselves from the toxic radioactive fallout of the fraudulent merger. Within minutes, the grand atrium was entirely empty, leaving only the scattered catering trays, the abandoned legal contracts, and the glowing red projection screens. I stood in the center of the stage, the heavy silence ringing in my ears. I looked down at the glass table. Brianna was still there. She had not run away because she had absolutely nowhere left to go. Her billionaire fiancé had abandoned her. Her parents were sitting in the back of federal transport vehicles. Her medical career was permanently destroyed, and her fraudulent wealth was completely gone. She slowly sank to her knees right there on the stage. The beautiful, arrogant, golden child who had tormented me for my entire life was completely broken. She crawled across the polished floor until she reached my feet. She grabbed the hem of my pristine white trousers, her hands shaking violently. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. She looked up at me, her voice a desperate, choking sob. She begged me to help her. She pleaded with me to tell the authorities that Marcus and Vivian had forced her into the scheme. She claimed she was just an innocent victim of their overwhelming expectations and that she never actually wanted to hurt me. She swore she would do anything I asked, promising to serve as my loyal assistant at the Cardiovascular Institute if I would just use my millions to pay off the Spencer family lawsuits and keep her out of federal prison. I looked down at the woman gripping my clothes. I remembered the harsh, burning smell of chlorine bleach. I remembered her cruel, victorious smirk as she watched my only professional blazer dissolve into a ruined, chemical-stained rag. I remembered every single time she had intentionally degraded me to elevate herself. I reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my tailored suit. I took a slow step back, ensuring a clean physical distance between my pristine white fabric and her desperate grasp. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice completely devoid of anger, sadness, or mercy. It was the calm, chilling voice of a woman who had just successfully executed a flawless war. I told her that she had spent her entire life trying to scrub away my success so she could shine a little brighter. I told her she poured bleach on my hard work because she thought a cheap trick could destroy a solid foundation. I leaned down just an inch, making sure she heard every single syllable of my final crushing blow. I whispered that bleach might ruin a cheap jacket, but it can never wash away a fundamentally rotten personality. I told her to enjoy the view from the bottom because I was never going to look down at her again. I turned my back on my sister, leaving her sobbing alone on the stage beneath the glowing crimson screens. I walked down the sweeping staircase and exited the ballroom, stepping out into the warm, bright air of the Atlanta evening. I was completely free. 2 years later, the heavy oak doors of the executive suite opened, but they did not bear the name of a hospital administrator who bowed to wealthy donors. The polished brass plaque on the frosted glass read, Zora Wright, Sterling Director of the Josephine Wright Cardiovascular Institute. I sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing the final blueprints for a new pediatric surgical wing. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine, perfectly tailored white lab coat draped over the back of my chair. The fallout from that night at the Woodruff Arts Center was swift, merciless, and absolutely absolute. Marcus and Vivian did not manage to buy their way out of federal prosecution. Elias Thorne's airtight paper trail, combined with the audio recording of their extortion attempt in my apartment, ensured a rapid conviction. They were both currently serving 5-year sentences in separate federal penitentiaries for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. Their sprawling Buckhead mansion, their luxury cars, and Vivian's entire collection of diamonds were seized and liquidated by the federal government to pay restitution to the Wright Medical Trust. Brianna did not fare any better. Richard Spencer made good on his threat to unleash his army of corporate litigators. He sued her into utter oblivion for breach of contract and fraudulent misrepresentation. Stripped of her fake medical residency and permanently blacklisted from the healthcare industry, Brianna was currently working as a cashier at a discount pharmacy in a strip mall outside the city. She spent her days ringing up prescriptions she was no longer allowed to write, her wages heavily garnished to pay off the massive legal judgments she owed to the Spencer Investment Group. Spencer himself had vanished from Atlanta high society. After being publicly humiliated and ousted from his family's firm, he had moved to Europe, living on a significantly reduced trust fund allowance, while his father actively groomed a more competent cousin to take over the empire. I closed the blueprint file and leaned back in my chair, looking at the framed photograph resting on my desk. It was an old black and white picture of Dr. Josephine Wright standing proudly outside a surgical theater. I had not just reclaimed her stolen fortune, I had actively resurrected her brilliant legacy. I used the recovered millions to establish an independent research institute dedicated entirely to advancing the cardiovascular algorithms my family had tried to steal. We were fully funded, entirely autonomous, and completely untouchable. They thought they could break me in that laundry room. They believed that pouring bleach over my only professional blazer would dissolve my ambition and permanently stain my future. But Marcus, Vivian, and Brianna fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the materials they were trying to destroy. Bleach only ruins cheap, superficial fabric. It strips away the artificial dye, the fake colors, and the meticulously constructed illusions. But when you strip all of that away, you are left with the core foundation. You are left with an indestructible, brilliant white thread that cannot be burned, cannot be corrupted, and cannot be erased. They tried to throw dirt on my name, but they only managed to clean the slate. I was no longer the scapegoat, I was the architect, and I was exactly where I belonged.